let's kick off.
I would go for it.
And we'll if people join. So thank you everybody who's joining up for this best practices and multi-step form design conversation. We've learned a lot about building these forms over the years at FormSort. And for those of you who don't know us yet, we're a form builder that kind of specializes in these customer-facing forms, oftentimes multi-step, where we're collecting a bunch of information. We've processed something like 500 million form starts to date. So we started to build up some data here and seen a lot of different versions of things. And we're really excited to share that with you. I'm Ben. I'm one of the co-founders of FormSort, and I've got with me my partner Phil, who is very, very qualified to talk about forms as our head of product, and in a previous life, an owner of many of these multi-step forms and other businesses, including our last business, Better.com. And so, with that in mind, the way we wanted to structure today is to do. We had a bunch of questions come in before, and so we have about 30 minutes of like those questions answered, and then we wanted to have sort of a few minutes at the end, 15 minutes for people to drop in questions. You can submit questions at any point during this conversation, and we'll try and answer those live as best as we can. There's a lot to cover here as well. This might end up being something we do more regularly, as we try to share some of the learnings we've accumulated working on forms over the years. And so we'll start off with this structured bit. We can probably jump right in. It's nice we have some visuals for these, because we have to prepare.
Great, thanks for the intro, Ben. So the first question, this is a question we get a lot, is, so what is the magic bullet to improve my multi-step form conversion? You may be a healthcare company trying to sign up patients. You may be a mortgage company trying to get pre-approvals. And everyone at the end of the day wants conversion, wants customers to get through to the product or service that you offer. And as a starting point, let's just clarify what we mean by multi-step form flow. We often call these flows here at FormSort. And it's a flow that's comprised of multiple forms. We're all familiar with forms, basic login form, password form, thing like that. Usually it's only one or two pieces of information. It's pretty clear what you're doing and why. But as more and more of our lives move online, there's multi-step form flows that are kind of all over the place. And what they're about is guiding people through a process that may be complicated, may have lots of branches and logic and different paths that it takes. It might be hundreds of steps long in some cases. Applying for home insurance and describing every single detail about your house and what coverage. Okay, cool. We're recording again. Sorry, I don't want to miss this for future. So we're not going to focus too much on forms themselves. There's actually a lot of resources about this online and in books. There's people have written entire books about form fields and how to do placeholders and validations and how to choose which elements to use. One great resource for this, I would say, is Nielsen Norman. You can find them at nngroup.com. They have many articles and videos about forms as a whole. So, there's obviously a lot to improve here, and you probably have some violations of common practices that you could stand to fix. But we're not going to focus on that in this talk. So, back to multi-step forms. What's the magic bullet to improving conversion? Well, it doesn't really exist, and this may be a kind of a cop-out answer, but in doing this now for 5 years here at FormSort and in doing it at many other companies before then, you really have to test and see what works for you, for your particular product, your particular service. And the reason is that people are all different, right? If you think of forms as the way we like to think about them as a structured conversation between people and computers, people are all different, right? You might have people who are very familiar with your product and are at your form flow just to kind of take care of some administrative task, right? They may already be users of yours. Um, and that's a very different persona with very different goals, very different motivations than someone who doesn't know what your product is and maybe just clicked an ad on Instagram and ended up in a form flow, right? Um, Even within a certain demographic of people, let's say home buyers, there may be people who have bought their first or in the process of buying their first home and don't know um, what's going on and what an interest rate is and whether, to do this or that. Or you may have people who are serial real estate investors who just want to get through and lock in a mortgage and get going. So there really is such a variety of users out there that will see your form flows, and there really isn't a single kind of magic bullet that will help them convert. But we'll get into some frameworks and ways to think about how you might be able to improve it in your particular case. So yeah, if you think about forms, like I mentioned before, they're this kind of conversational, structured approach to collecting data. And one thing to think about is the spectrum, right? Where at a certain point, if someone's filling out a form, they are really just filling in a row in a database in most cases. Um, and on the other end of the spectrum would be, having a phone call, right? Where there's a lot of just human conversation, right? Most conversations I'm participating in, right? They start with, "How's your day today? What's going on? I hope you're doing well." And there is an exchange of data that happens, right? But it's not as kind of pared down as inserting a database row or something like that. And so we really like forms, and I think a lot of people use forms because they're this good medium between having a very open-ended conversation and a more kind of transactional, almost like spreadsheet level conversation. And so my first tip is really like read your form aloud. And this may be kind of silly, um, and isn't necessarily a magic bullet, but I think it can really identify places where things are awkward or robotic or seem forced. And it's a good place to identify things that might not actually make sense, right? So the exercise here would be really just sit down in your office or sign up on a Zoom call with a coworker of yours and really read your form out loud as if you were the computer, as if you were the website, and have that person respond and see where the kind of hangups happen, right? Where is there a disconnect? Where does it maybe not clear what you're asking for or how to answer it? So that's a great way to get started. And you'll find that a lot of these forms that you read, even your own, you may have spent weeks, months, years working on, will have some weird kind of cases. So consider the form as a conversation and make sure that it reads as a conversation, or at least doesn't violate rules of conversation too clearly or too in too big of a way. The other kind of tip I'll give that's really, I think, important to remember is similar to Jacob's Law, which is an often repeated kind of slogan of design on the web, is that users spend most of their time on other websites. And extending that to forms and form flows, users spend most of their time on other form flows. And what that means is, doing something that's too crazy, too different, too novel, is often a disruption, right? It brings attention to that detail of your design. Let's say like an animation or something that is maybe neat, maybe looks really nice when your design agency puts it in front of you. But it may actually distract from the goal of having a conversation with the person and kind of moving them forward and moving them along in your kind of data collection needs. So keep that in mind. I would say one thing I didn't add to the slides, but I'd also want to mention is that even though users spend most of their time on other people's forums, don't think that those forms are necessarily perfect or completed, or that those people at those companies know more than you, right? You are uniquely positioned to understand your users and what their needs are and what questions to ask them. And so even though one of your competitors maybe starts with a particular question or has a particular order of content or does or not, does not do some specific thing, that doesn't mean that you need to, right? There's a whole world of experimentation to do, and we'll get into some tips there, that does not require you to, break the rules of user experience that people are familiar with on other websites. So, don't break the inputs, but really think about the content and the order of the content and how that conversation unfolds. So another question we get a lot, and we got for this talk, is how do I identify bottlenecks in my form flow? And this is a really good question because bottlenecks are really important. So one kind of beginning measure to make sure that you have, and we are FormSort, we do have this built in to our tool, but you can use a lot of analytics tools to do this kind of thing, is to measure the overall conversion. And so to do that, you want to count the number of responders, people filling out your form that started the flow, and divide that by, actually, did I accidentally have these inverted? I do. Oh my God. Anyway, how many people reached a business goal over how many people started the form flow? So flip this upside down. But what that will get you is, yeah, how many people, achieved some goal. And that goal bit is really important because a lot of people just measure until the form ends, right? Until there's like no other questions left, or until people reach some sort of dead end in the flow. And that's not really a good measure because you're, at the end of the day, you want to achieve your business goal, right? You don't want to necessarily optimize for number of form flows completed. If you get focused too much on that, you'll end up removing questions and just kind of like getting, really into optimizing people to go through. But if those people go through and then aren't good patients or good borrowers or good users later on, you're actually probably optimizing for the wrong thing. So the other tip here is when you think about conversion rate, overall conversion rate, you really have to be careful about traffic mix. This is a really common conversation that we have at FormSort is somebody will come to us and say, hey, we didn't change anything in our flow, but our conversion is way down. What's going on, right? And, one thing that we've gotten into asking is, well, did you change where the people are coming from, right? Did you change your traffic sources? And more often than not, that's a reason that overall form conversion will go down. If you launch a new marketing campaign and that campaign is poorly targeted, if you're selling boats and all of a sudden you have a bunch of people who live in the desert coming to your form, they're not going to convert, even though your form itself, your form flow itself is really good and optimized for that. So that's one thing to always keep in mind as you look at overall conversion numbers is, yeah, where are the people coming from? And making sure that that lines up with the people that are, the intended people to go through your form flow. So this one I have right is measuring the actual step conversion is a little bit of a better measure in terms of actually being able to affect what your form flow converts and how to actually make progress towards improving it. Overall conversion is hard because it's hard to say, okay, the form's not converting well, what do I do? But if you measure it down at the level of the step, you can actually start to think about, well, that step has these particular questions or has this particular content. How do I improve that? How do I, what are some of the levers that I can do and launch today or in an experiment and actually improve that conversion rate? And what you'll see, and we see something like this in pretty much every single flow across all industries and all sizes of companies, is something like this. The number of people who will drop off of a particular step. So they loaded step A, but they did not reach the next step, step B. This will be very different between different steps, right? And often you'll see most steps have very little drop, right? If you're just asking for the next little bit of information or clarifying something. But there's a big drop off pretty much always on the first step. And there's usually one or two other steps later in the process that tend to have most of the drop off. And that's actually a really good thing, because if you start to look at your form flow in this way, those are the things you want to look at and start to address. So, we use the word a lot, like funnel, right? Like it's a form funnel, or, there's this sort of conversion pipeline, right? There's a lot of liquid analogies that, flow that are present in this space. And, if you think about it as a pipe, right? If you have a pipe where water's flowing into, and then there's a constriction, right? There's this little bottleneck. Literally, the neck of a bottle is smaller than the rest of the bottle. That's really what you want to optimize for, because if you are making anything ahead of the bottleneck wider, you're just going to get more liquid jammed up at the bottleneck. And same thing, if you're optimizing after the bottleneck, the same amount of water is going to flow through, right? It's confined at that constriction. There's a pretty well-known kind of like business school book about this you might be interested in, called The Goal, which has the most ridiculous looking cover for such a good book. But it talks a lot about this, is that if you have a process and you're optimizing things that are not the bottleneck, you really aren't going to optimize the overall throughput. And so thankfully, once we've found the bottlenecks within our form flow, we have a good place to start and actually optimize the overall throughput, which then increases the overall conversion rate that we talked about at the beginning. So we had to do this. We came up with a fun acronym to help you remember different techniques that you can have to optimize a particular step or part of the process. And we call that MUD. Your responders can get stuck in the mud. And we'll get into this, but most of the time when there's a problem with a particular step or set of questions that people get stuck at, it either has to do with motivation, whether the user actually wants to answer a question, usability, whether the user can answer the question, right? Or difficulty, if the user has trouble actually getting the answer, even though they want to give it to you and they can provide it, but they just don't know or have the answer. So, like I said, motivation. Do I want to provide an answer? This has a lot to do with incentives, with trust, whether what you're asking for is relevant to what the person is trying to accomplish or get from your service. So again, motivation is all about whether the person wants to do something. Usability, it's, can I provide an answer? And oftentimes this has to do with the sort of basic form design principles, like having labels for fields, or having validation that doesn't get in the way of entering something, or letting people access your form using the keyboard or using a phone or using accessibility devices if they're using them. So that's a really important factor as well, right? If I am motivated to give you an answer, but I'm having trouble typing it in, that will really affect the step conversion. And lastly, and this is often, I think, forgotten about, is difficulty. So there may be things that I am totally happy giving to you, and I can actually operate the controls, but I myself may need to go find the answer, right? And so for these things, think about, finding your last year's W-2 form, or what type of roof does your house have, or that kind of thing. Like, what is your spouse's social security number? These things may take some time to find, and your form needs to accommodate that. So let's get into some examples. So this is a kind of fake question. It's a bottleneck at the first step. Like we said, this is a very common thing. It's often called bounce rate in analytics, in form design, as well as in general websites. And this usually comes down to the M of MUD, a motivation issue. So if we look at this particular form, uh, there's not really a problem in usability, right? It's pretty clear what to do here. Just click next or tab to next and press enter. There's not really a difficulty issue. Like it's pretty, I don't need to actually go get anything or answer anything for you. But it's really about motivation here, right? Like, wait, well, why are you collecting data? Who are you? Like, why am I even in this process, right? Is this for me? Like, how long is this going to take? So to solve this kind of thing, if you find, that kind of motivation bottleneck, like I mentioned, targeting is very important. If you're targeting the wrong people, no matter how good your form is, they're not going to convert it because they don't need what you're offering. But providing context, setting expectations, giving encouragement are all really important, right? Here we've just said, this is a 5-minute form. When you're done with it, you're going to receive prescriptions at your address. And it's a company, and maybe there's a photo of a person. Really, you should use photos and not emoji, but it's a much improved thing. So here we've talked about, we've really tried to optimize the motivation of continuing in this particular step. Another case would be, we've looked at our step drop-off and there's a bottleneck at an address question. And this, motivation-wise, maybe I've gotten through and, okay, I'm trying to get prescriptions from a healthcare provider. I have the motivation to do it, but this kind of thing often is a usability issue. I'm using placeholders and I don't have labels. I might get confused as to which field goes where. I have to type it in and I may make mistakes and all that kind of stuff. And so, here, really use those form field best practices, right? So, use labels, use standard components, don't try to be clever. Use autofill or autocomplete. That's huge, right? The best question is one that I don't even have to answer. And as much as you can, try to pre-fill information that you already know or skip it, right? Often you may already know something or have some other source of data that can answer a question. And again, the best question is ones that's not asked, because you can just continue on. And lastly, let's look at a case of a bottleneck at a document upload. So again, here, maybe I already have the motivation. I know I'm going to get prescriptions at the end of this. This type of control is pretty standard, familiar, easy to use. Perhaps like if I have a file, I can drop it in, or on a phone, I can click and get it. But this kind of thing is often a difficulty issue, right? If you think about finding your health insurance card, like, do you know where your health insurance card is right now? And if you have it, do you have a way of scanning it or taking a photo and you're like emailing or texting the photo to yourself to put into this form or something like that? These kinds of things are all over the place and they're complicated and they're difficult, right? And the thing I always think about is, we had this big issue at Better Mortgage, right, where people would often apply for mortgage with a co-borrower, usually their partner, and usually people apply during the day where their partner is working, right? And so there'd be this thing where you'd stop and you'd be stuck because, I need my wife or partner or husband to get me something and they're not available, right? So your conversion ends there and people may be frustrated enough to not even come back. And so things to improve here would be, allow alternatives, right? If there's something that you can do to get the data elsewhere, right? So maybe connecting directly to an insurance company and fetching the data that you need, that's great. A lot of things that you think are really required, like maybe skipped, right? They may be possible to do later. And that's a great thing to lean into is like, if you don't absolutely need it right now, let people defer it to later through something like a skip button or thing like that. And lastly, like, especially for these sort of considered purchases, right, where people may be exploring your product or service for days or weeks, make sure that you allow and support people returning later to like a half completed form and pick up where they started. So that's something that we work a lot on at FormSort, is allowing those kinds of use cases where you have people coming back over time, even as the form changes, even as other things change, to pick up where they left off. And that'll probably be a topic for another talk, because there's a whole lot just in that area there. Another question we always get, and this is the last one, we're almost done with the sort of talk part, is, well, experimenting is great, cool. I can look at my drop off and see what to do, and but I want to do. Oh, sorry, my cat is hunting, so there will be some noise in the background. That's all great, and if I have 1 million people showing up in my forum, then I can launch statistically significant experiments every day to try all these things out and make sure they work. But what if I only have dozens or maybe hundreds of responders a month? If you throw that into a stat-sig calculator, that's not going to be significant for weeks or months or ever in some cases. And so the solution here is really like, you need to make big effects. You need to make big changes to make sure that if you do run tests, which you should, that you can actually see the results, that you can see their impact. And tweaking button colors on a button may have a difference at scale, may have a difference, overall, but you're not going to see it if you only have a couple dozen or a couple hundred responders coming through in a given period of time. So I'm going to go through kind of a couple of like drastic changes you can try that have effect. And again, I don't think there's one way or another that these go, because it really differs based on who your users are, what your product is, what your service is. But let's go through some of them. So this is, I think, probably the biggest like argument that product and marketing teams have is, should we ask for an email right at the beginning, or create an account to continue, or is that something we can leave to the end, right? And if you look at the left, this is sort of what the marketing team might prefer, right? If we get their email, if we get their contact info, we can retarget them, we can reach out later, we can put them in our drip campaign, we can kind of, work on converting them. And there's merit to that, right? Most conversions don't happen on first touch, especially for complicated products. And so that makes a lot of sense. But on the other hand, if you have this, you haven't provided any value. You haven't really started the conversation with the user at this time, right? And so they don't know whether to trust you. They don't know what you're even offering. They don't know, what it is that they're going to get. And so this approach has a lot of merit to it. You might be able to bring people along a little bit, show what you're going to do, give them some value along the way, and then give them the personal information that might be a little, or then ask for the personal information that might be a little hard to, get right at the beginning. And so, yeah, there's trade-offs here, right? Ask for email early, ask for email later. There's not really, I've seen it work both ways, and I've seen people improve their overall conversion both ways. So you really have to find out for yourself. But that's a really great experiment to try, and it will be dramatic. You will see one way or the other, it works or it doesn't work. And this can depend on, how good your whole marketing strategy is, and how compelling your product is, how good your brand is. Importantly, if you are Instagram or something like that, where everyone knows you, if you look at those sign-up forms, it's just email and password and you're done, right? But something that's less well known, or more nuanced, more poorly understood, you may want to actually kind of go through a bit of setup before going towards that. Here's another experiment to run, and it can be very drastic and actually very easy to run. This one is provide context and explanation, right? Like be verbose and like more conversational, or be a little bit more terse, right? If you think about how people have conversations in the real world, both of these strategies can work, right? And having context and explanation can really help new users in particular, right? Let's explain exactly what we're about to do. Let's explain what we just did. Let's kind of ease you into things, maybe even putting in steps that don't ask for anything, right? they don't necessarily reduce conversion overall, right? You don't only always have to cut down clicks to improve conversion, especially when you're explaining what you do and how it works. But on the other hand, like the terse, more to the point form also works, right? If you have more sophisticated users, more advanced users, users who might be familiar with what they're doing, the context and explanation may get in the way, right? Or may kind of slow them down. So, you know, one thing too, like you all probably have not read all the text in this presentation. Like most users won't read the text that you've crafted in your forms either. But so again, this isn't like one way or the other will win. And you might actually want to offer both, right? Your first question or data that you provide into the form, you may want to say, hey, is this your first time doing this? And provide more context or explanation for novice users and have a more condensed version or, you know, a variant of the flow that is deployed for expert users may be, you know, an alternative. So again, there's not a single kind of magic bullet to which one of these will be better, but both are worth trying. And the third experiment, and this one is really kind of part of the reason we even started form sort is, you know, how spaced out should stuff be, right? Do you put a lot of questions on a single page and, you know, kind of have a form that's a little bit more chunky where, you know, you do everything related to your medical history on one page, and then you do everything related to payment on their page, that kind of thing? Or do you space it out? Do you do one thing at a time? If you look at the left and right here, they're both exactly the same content in terms of the data that will be collected, the text that's there, the choices. But they're very different, you know, multi-step forms, right? And there's benefits to both, right? On the left, I can see immediately what's coming up. I can kind of prepare for it mentally. I know at a glance how long this will take me. I can determine, like, is it appropriate for me? Do I have to go fetch something? You know, I can do a little bit more quickly too, perhaps, right? I'm just tabbing or clicking between fields or scrolling between fields and getting it, you know, all at once. On the other hand, the other one, you know, might give you a little bit more focus, right? Might be a little bit less stressful if you don't see all the stuff that you necessarily have to do. But on the flip side, people might get stressed out that they don't know what's coming up, right? And so on the right side, you might need to do things like progress bars or more expectation setting and make sure that you got this order correctly, because if people try to do things out of order, it's not going to work. And again, like with the other one, there's no magic bullet. You have to test, you have to see what works and iterate and improve on that. Because yeah, even in this kind of put everything on one page or space it out, we've seen experiments go even within, say, healthcare, even within, say, D2C healthcare, you know, weight loss providers, this go both ways. So hopefully glean something interesting from this talk. Remember MUD, motivation, usability, difficulty. Remember there is no magic bullet, and, you know, try to run some of these experiments. Try to run, you know, where you get into personal information, how much context or explanation do you provide, and, you know, how many questions per page you do. Those are all things that will really help you understand, or, you know, understand and improve your conversion overall over time as you get to kind of finesse those conversations that you have with your users. So with that, there's a little bit of time for Q&A, and I think there's a couple of questions. Ben, do you want to read them out?
Yeah, sure. First question here, and this is sort of feeds off the last one. Should I design for mobile or desktop? You know, how do you think about designing across different devices? And what does it mean to design for mobile in today's world, or desktop in today's world?
Yeah, it's a really cool question. Yeah, I remember so before all this, I worked at Google, and I was there on, it was like 2011, and there was this one day where it was announced that more queries had been done on mobile than on desktop for the first time ever. And that was 12 years ago, right? Which is a huge amount of time in the web world. And so yeah, like the cliche is mobile is eating the world, etc. My recommendation is always to design in a mobile sized viewport at the beginning. A mobile design will always work and function on a desktop size, even if it's not beautiful or perfect. That's not true for desktop getting down to mobile, right? You might end up with things that are just totally out of size, out of proportion. And so, yeah, that would be my recommendation. I think one thing to in particular take care with on mobile forms is scrolling, where if you have a long form, if you do this experiment of multiple questions in one step, scrolling is kind of like a bad thing usually because people might not see where the next button is, or that they're missing a question, or that some validation error has occurred. In form sort, we try to handle a lot of those cases out of the box, but that's something to consider always when designing for mobile, is making sure that try to minimize scroll. One other thing I would say on mobile design is people can get quite distracted on their phones. And this is kind of maybe a little bit nuanced, but if you do something like an email verification step in your flow, where you ask them for an email, they receive an email, and then they have to click in the email to continue, that person is now in their email, right? Like the email is now their whole phone, and they may see something else and may get distracted. And so that's another thing to think about in terms of how you design for that mobile experience, is not just what does the page itself look like and how does that behave within that little box, but consider the fact that they're physically on a phone that can display one thing at a time, and that the size is smaller. Yeah, that helps with that question.
I'm turning off my video for right now, but are there any good rules of thumb for what format to use for a select question based on the number of choices? So when to choose buttons versus lists versus a drop down?
That's a great question. Actually, I don't have this as a slide, but we recently looked at this within form sort, is like, what is the distribution of the number of choices that people have for select questions. So I'm not writing in a value, I'm choosing between known values. And generally the rule of thumb is, it's sort of similar to the first one. It's like, if you can fit it in one viewport, usually buttons make sense. And that kind of depends, but if you have more than 6 or 7 choices, it's probably not going to fit, and I would not recommend doing that. But if you just have 6 or 7 choices, choosing one and clicking one is usually a better approach than having something like a drop-down. Because the drop-down requires me to open it. It then needs to take up space. I need to be able to search through it, that kind of thing. That said, if you have many choices, right? So probably the most common one is picking which state you're in or which country you're in, right? 50 or 180 choices. You don't want to scroll past 180 choices to put in which country you're from. And so in that case, using a drop-down is really good. One thing that we don't really recommend is sliders. People really want to like these for making a choice between things, but there's some, rules of sliders, which is one, a slider is always, something is always picked in a slider. You can't have an unpicked slider, right? It's one of this, one of the values will always be toggled. So that may or may not make sense. You're gonna kind of nudge your users towards that choice that you have preset. And then the other thing is, like, those values are ordered, right? And so if you don't have a natural order to what you're picking from, then that doesn't make sense either. And lastly, sliders often conflict with like mobile browser like swipe actions. And so you may end up with people accidentally navigating to the previous page or something like that. But yeah, generally above like 6 or 7 choices, I would go for drop downs with search. And then below that, I would just do straight buttons. I think we have time for probably one more question. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Follow up to that one is when should we be using grid questions versus select questions?
Oh, yeah. So grid question is, you are asking people to answer multiple questions that each have the same scale, right? So you often see these in consumer surveys, right? Which of the following brands how do you feel about the following brands, right? And it's, from 0 to 10, 0 is the worst, 10 is the best. And you ask each of those, you might ask that same question 10 different times. Now, I could do that as 6 separate select questions, and that can work, right? I think especially on mobile, that works quite well because you don't have space for a multi-select kind of grid layout. But if you are using if your user is predominantly on desktop, it can be a big space saver to have a grid where they just select a radio button for each choice and continue on. So that one is kind of device specific, I would say, and I don't necessarily recommend using grids on mobile devices if you can avoid it.
Follow up to the slider question.
Great.
How do we handle questions where there's like a rating from like 0 to 100? What are alternatives to sliders?
Rating from 0 to 100. Well, I guess how precise does it need to be would be the first thing I would ask, right? If you can get away with like a categorical ranking, that's good. You could just have 10 buckets, something like that. And if you really just want a number, right? If it's like 0 to 100, please enter your score for this. Like, just have a number input. Number inputs, HTML now, like form sort supports this. You click into it, only the number pad is shown. People can really quickly type a value that they want, and it's pretty foolproof, and it works decently well. Especially if you think about on a mobile device, you might have a few hundred pixels and of width in the viewport. So, and then you have a slider that takes up most of that width, and then you have 100 values within that slider. You have 3 or 4 pixels per number, right? You're going to be struggling to get a specific number anyway, right? There's no way that you're going to accurately be able to type 83. And so again, I would either lose the need for that high fidelity input if you don't need it, or I would have them type a number. That's kind of a good approach there. Any other questions?
I think we're at
It's pretty
time
fun.
now. We're a couple minutes over. There was one more question about when to use native components versus non-native components, and thoughts on that. But I think we should probably save that one for next time and let everybody go. So thank you everybody for showing up. Hope you learned something today. If you have more questions, shoot us an email. We'd love to help find you answers. Take care.
Cool. This is a lot of fun. Thank you. Bye.